to FO Podcasts. This is Atul Singh. With me is Nasir Khilji again. He retired as a senior economist in the US Treasury. He has a wealth of experience and knowledge. And since he originally comes from Pakistan, we are going to discuss the Pakistani economy today. So, Nasir, Pakistan has been in the news. It has been facing a crisis. We keep hearing that the economy is in free fall. So, paint us a picture. What is going on with the Pakistani economy?
Okay, thank you, Atul. It's good to be back. It's a tall order what's happening to the Pakistani economy, because one of the thing any analyst that needs to talk about the Pakistani economy would be to take a deep dive, which inexorably means that one has to go into the historical background and stuff. But I'm going to dispense with that for the moment and just focus on exactly what's happening presently. Mm-hmm. Over the last year, Pakistan has experienced historically high inflation rates for a number of reasons. One is worldwide.
If I may interject, what is historically high? Is it 100%? Is it 170%?
Okay, before last year, or even let's go back pre-COVID days. Prior to COVID, on the average, the Pakistani economy had its ups and downs, but never experienced double-digit inflation. It generally had an inflation less than 6-7%, year in, year out, for a number of reasons. One of them was that Pakistan has always had budget deficits, which has meant that the state bank, which is the central bank of Pakistan, has had to monetize the debt, because the private sector doesn't buy up all government debt. And since Pakistan has always had a public deficits that we can talk some more about later,
yes,
the central bank has had to monetize it, which has meant that the rupee has the purchasing power of the rupee, which is the currency in Pakistan, has tended to depreciate on the average by 5 to 6% a year, starting in the 50s. After COVID, of course, like all the other economies, Pakistan had its share of high oil prices. Energy prices went up because Pakistan is mainly an oil importer, although it does have some natural gas, but mainly all oil is imported. So clearly, when the oil prices went up after COVID, Pakistan had to pay a higher bill, and that meant. And oil is an input into all the other stuff. So, that was one reason that inflation went up.
So historically high inflation thanks to the Russia-Ukraine war and other factors. And what else is going on?
And Pakistan has historically, again, by historical standards, has had a substantial devaluation of the Pakistani currency. Mm-hmm. Again, because of a balance of payment deficit, and because of the high cost of all the other stuff that's being imported and high public deficits and lack of confidence in the rupee has depreciated about 30%. So a year ago, we were talking about 180 rupees to a dollar. Now it's 300. Oof. So you can do a rule of thumb that for every 1%, decrease in the rupee, the inflation rate probably goes up by 1%. So there you have, because everything, all imported items go up in rupee terms. So that's a 1-to-1 kind of thing. So if we've had a 30% depreciation, you would expect a 30% rise in prices over the last year. That's by historical standards, a very high depreciation of the currency.
Got it. Again, so the currency is going down, inflation is going up, debt payments.
Debt payments, again, which a lot of them are foreign debt. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the math, foreign debt comprises about 1/3 of Pakistan total public debt. So then if you have a 1% increase in the rupee, in the dollar, then your service payments goes up by 1/3 of that. just because of the rupee,
Yeah.
in rupee terms. In dollar terms, it stays the same,
Yes.
but that means you have to, like get more money out there. So that's another factor that weighs in on that. So first of all, let's look at the background of Pakistan.
Exactly.
Like
I was going to get to it, that
Yeah.
you talked about going into a deep dive.
Yeah. So let's do a deep dive.
Why, for instance, which is a question we have discussed informally, why has Pakistan stumbled from one crisis to another?
Exactly.
What is the history?
So if I may, let me take 5 minutes and
you can take 10.
Okay. So let's just okay. So by way of background, although I've been in the US Treasury for 14 years, my favorite developing country is Pakistan. And in fact, my PhD dissertation, which was done in the late 70s, was the first macroeconometric model of the Pakistan economy that I pioneered and I built.
Oh, wow. So we are going back to the future. We are going back to your PhD dissertation now.
So that was my first study of the Pakistan economy when I was a young man and I was embarking on a journey to do a macroeconomic study of a developing economy. So I learned development economics on the way, and I got to learn all the statistics of Pakistan because I had to build a disaggregated macroeconomic model which mimicked the economy. It covered all sectors. It covered basically the value-added sectors like agricultural, manufacturing, services. On the production side, it covered the expenditure side, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, the balance of payments. It covered prices, the formation of prices, how they were formed in Pakistan. And so the entire structure of the Pakistani economy was mimicked by my model, and the purpose was simulations. The purpose, it was based on empirical data, and I estimated structural parameters, and it was like about close to a 70 equation model. It covered inflation, interest rates, that tied up everything, and the balance of payments, and so on. So at that time, when I did my simulations and forecast of the Pakistan economy, and my forecast started around 1970 onward. No, actually, because I finished my dissertation by 1979, 1980. So I was forecasting for the next 10 years. So in that context, when I was looking forward, I could see that Pakistan has always had budget deficits, federal budget deficit, structurally. Basically, the revenues, the tax revenues, income taxes, custom duties, indirect taxes, they did not cover the entire federal spending of the government, which consisted of current and development expenditures. So there was a chronic shortage. At the same time, the balance of payment had a deficit. Pakistan's exports were always less than imports. So how were the two deficits being covered? Luckily for Pakistan, until that time, because Pakistan was the frontier state in a Cold War, it got very good, generous assistance from the international bodies like the IMF, the World Bank, and the USA. So given all that lending and financing of the budget deficits and the trade deficits, Pakistan could cushion and did not experience high inflation rates.
So de facto, Pakistan was subsidized by the US because of Cold War reasons.
And the international bodies.
And
at the bidding of the USA anyway.
Like the International Monetary Fund and to probably a lesser degree, the World Bank.
Exactly. And given that fact, given that Pakistan was subsidized and it was like a frontier state, the rupee was always highly valued. It was overvalued, one would say.
I see.
And it was subsidized by the central bank. So the central bank was subsidizing the rupee so that industries that would have had a natural advantage of being set up could not be set up because imports were cheaper than making them at home. And that in a way, and Pakistan was subsidizing manufacturers, for example, at the expense of agricultural sector. because they were trying to build up a manufacturing base.
That is in the 60s, early 60s.
It was in the early 60s to late 60s, and even in the 70s.
I see.
And essentially and there's a thing, you probably heard of it, it's called the Leontief paradox.
Yes, of course. We read it when professors like you teach us.
Yeah. And at that time, it was actually noted in the Indian context, not in the Pakistani context, but it applied to countries like Pakistan too, that if you were to think that one of the competitive advantage India and Pakistan would have would be exports of labor-intensive goods.
Yes.
And, imports of capital-intensive goods, there was a vice versa going on. So in other words, a lot of goods that India was exporting were intensive. And if they were exporting capital-intensive goods, the employment in the capital sector isn't that much anyway.
Correct.
So you had like a labor-abundant economy. Instead of taking a natural advantage of labor-intensive goods being exported, they were exporting capital-intensive goods. So they weren't creating much employment in the domestic sector. And the reason was that because of overvalued currencies, that were importing all the machinery, plant, and equipment, and for that reason. So Pakistan went
that
through
is
that
the paradox.
That was the paradox.
Yeah.
That where you would expect a labor-abundant economy to be exporting labor-intensive goods, it was actually exporting capital-intensive goods, India. But same applied to Pakistan. So that was a structural case.
So just to summarize for the listeners, Pakistan from the 60s, onwards tried industrialization, but because its rupee was overvalued, they were not competitive vis-a-vis, let's say, the South Asian economies, the Asian tigers, who had a currency that arguably was perhaps a bit undervalued. So their industry streaked ahead or raced ahead of Pakistan, and consequently left Pakistan. And of course, until recently, until the 1990s, when the Indian economy opened up, even India deindustrializing paradoxically.
Exactly. I agree with it. And another thing to add to the Asian tigers, one of the qualities, they had a highly skilled labor force.
Yes.
Much educated and skilled.
Yeah.
If the Asian tigers had one advantage, although they didn't have much natural resources, they had fairly well-educated people and, of course, enlightened leadership.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And they also, just to add one little fact, which is important for our listeners to notice, that the Asian tigers really focused on female literacy. The female literacy rates were really high. Ipso facto, their women workers were extremely productive compared to, let's say, India or Pakistan.
Exactly. And literacy rates were low in India and Pakistan. Clearly, that's the case. By way of perspective, let's start the story for Pakistan from 1958 onwards, when Ayub Khan, a military general, took over the government. Although he set many wrong precedents, some of the precedent that he did set, first of all, like we just talked about industrialization, rapid industrialization. That is the first time, I think, after Ayub Khan came in, that economists got prominence in policy making. Thanks again to USAID that brought in the Harvard Advisory Group to really help Pakistan plan. The 5-year planning for growth and prosperity began during that time in earnest. So there were targets established that had to be achieved for 5 years for Pakistan's rapid industrialization and growth. So there were many fronts under Ayub Khan that the country did embark on progress and development. Growth rates were GDP growth rates, again, by way of perspective. Under Ayub Khan, they grew at 6% a year, starting from 1960 all the way to 1969. Ayub Khan was at least enlightened enough to think about female literacy. He started family planning.
Which for our Western listeners means a focus on contraception and lowering the number of children women have.
Exactly, exactly. So that you don't have a lot of illiterate young population without any employment opportunities. So all those were progressive reforms at the advice of the Harvard Advisory Group, paid for by the USAID, Agency for International Development, the World Bank. Economics as a field became prominent in Pakistan. Until that time, I didn't even know what economics was. And I was a teenager, and I never thought I'd end up being an economist and doing a podcast with you because I didn't know what economics was.
So we can thank General Ayub Khan for this.
Well, at least the economists who were prominent, Pakistani, who were at the World Bank at the time, they were brought into Pakistan and they headed the Ministry of Finance and they moved forward. So Pakistan was progressing fairly rapidly from 1960 to 69. Again, by way of perspective, South Korea had less exports than Pakistan at the time, and they would send teams to Pakistan to learn from the Pakistani planning experience. And in fact, when Ayub Khan gave up the country to another military dictator, Yahya Khan, the Economist wrote that Yahya Khan has inherited an economy that would turn any third world dictator green with envy.
So The Economist, which is 1843 vintage, and the publication of the British establishment, was singing paeans to General Ayub Khan. That's high praise.
Yeah, at least the economy that inherited by Yahya Khan. So Pakistan had progress. You can liken it to a child, Atul, that a child has to grow anyway. So when Pakistan emerged after the Brits left, it was like a kid. And it did grow. And Ayub Khan at least nurtured it, gave it some water and fertilizer along the way. So it did grow, definitely. There were a lot of bad precedents set.
Sure.
The emergence of the military in Pakistan's internal and external affairs. So that has been now a structural impediment, and Pakistan has never got out of it.
So we are jumping the gun.
Yeah.
So we've got to the 60s. Yahya Khan inherits an economy that would be the envy of any third world dictator. And, so far, until 69, things are going well, swimmingly well. In fact, Pakistan is ahead of South Korea. And of course, there is no comparison now between South Korea and Pakistan. So what goes wrong after 1969?
Okay, that's a very good question. The first thing that goes wrong is political. Pakistan gets into a civil war with its eastern, province, East Pakistan.
Now Bangladesh.
That emerged after a very bloody civil war in 1971. Now, there's a historical reason why the two provinces split. It was primarily economics and discrimination. East Pakistan, which was more populous at the time, felt that it was discriminated against by West Pakistan, which is now Pakistan. So that's one big thing that happened. Politically, the other big thing happened is that Yahya Khan, to his credit, had the most fairest elections that have ever been recorded in Pakistan history. And it so emerged that a party which predominantly had a majority in East Pakistan and also had majority of seats in the National Assembly was denied the government by the military dictator.
Wasn't Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to blame as well for that?
I'm coming to Bhutto, who is the primary villain. If there's any primary villain in the story of Pakistan, unlike a lot of people who do not understand the role of Bhutto, and we can do another podcast, a political role of Bhutto, and how
we will.
And
but
how that has. But essentially, what happened is Mujibur Rahman, who was a leader of a regional party out of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, he got the entire National Assembly seats that belonged to East Pakistan. And Bhutto, who had started his own party called the People's Party, Pakistan People's Party, PPP they call it these days. So essentially what happened that although he emerged victorious in West Pakistan, but he was a minority compared to the overall seats in the National Assembly. He refused to go to the National Assembly. And Yahya Khan, who was from the same province as Bhutto, and who wanted to stay on as president, the military dictator, Bhutto, in a way, assured him that if he could get Bhutto to be the prime minister, who was a minority compared to Mujibur Rahman, he would keep on Yahya Khan, unlike Mujib, who did not agree with that. And also, East Pakistan had a number of grievances that had accumulated from partition of India ever since it came into existence. So that was number one political event that broke up the country. The number two event, we were talking about Bhutto. So once that country broke up and East Pakistan went its own way, the West Pakistan was given over to Bhutto, who basically was a minority candidate. But now that there was only one province, he emerged as the majority candidate without having fresh elections. The military handed it over to him, and he went into socialism. He nationalized the entire industrial sector of Pakistan.
So, in a way, this is precisely the period when Indira Gandhi takes over India. And she's now becoming some kind of goddess figure after the victory in the 1971 India-Pakistan war. And she also embraces socialism and basically decimates the Indian economy. So in a way, these are parallels. 1970s. It's parallel stories.
Exactly, parallel stories. So Pakistan, like in answer to your question, that was going along smoothly. Industry was, and in fact, I would give parallels to the South Koreans. You've heard of the shibolats.
Of course, yeah, chaebols. Yeah, chaebols.
They basically are like houses of families.
Industrial families.
Industrial families that are monopolies, but they are progressing. They're developing the Hyundais and, all those.
The Samsungs.
Similarly, there were like about 20 to 21 families that were dominant in banking and manufacturing and others. But when it was all nationalized, or those equivalent of chaebols were disbanded.
So they probably left for Dubai and England and elsewhere.
Coupled with a lot of these industrialists were from an Islamic sect called Ahmadis.
Aha.
And Bhutto added another injury that
insult to injury.
Insult. He declared the Ahmadi group
non-Muslims
as non-Muslims.
This is 1974, isn't it?
Exactly, while he was still the prime minister. So first he socialized their stuff, then he calls them non-Muslims, so they're driven away from the country. So the entire entrepreneurial class and the industrial sector is disbanded, and now you have a situation. Okay, and at the same time, the oil wealth was discovered by the Middle East as oil prices went up. And, OPEC was formed. So when all that oil money started flowing into Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, they needed to build up their economies and build up, structures and so on. And sure enough, they got all this labor-abundant economies like India and Pakistan, sending their labor over to the Middle East. So that brought in a lot of remittances from the Middle East to the Pakistan economy, which again had an overvalued currency. So now you had the Middle East in a way contributing to keeping their rupee overvalued.
Deindustrialization again. Now, if I may very quickly give parallels from another time, and I will give the example of France. To our French listeners and our European listeners, they will remember St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So what happened that day in 1572 is that Catherine de' Medici, the nice Italian de facto queen ruling France, ordered the slaughter of the Huguenots, the French Protestants. And the Huguenots fled en masse. They fled to Switzerland, taking watchmaking with them. That's why Tissot and all these watches in Switzerland are all Huguenots. They took banking, not just to Switzerland, but to England. I used to live in the Huguenot Quarter. I used to live on 40 Folgate Street next to the Spitalfields Market. And that was where the Huguenots came and brought with them banking knowledge. And they were amongst the communities that led to London becoming a financial capital of the world. And of course, the Huguenots fled to Prussia, that later led to the reunification of Germany. And lest we forget the great author of The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Do you remember the author?
Adam Smith?
No, Adam Smith is the Scotsman.
Okay. Who was this one?
Max Weber. I was referring to.
Max Weber.
And we may not be at our sharpest today. Maybe we've eaten it, too rich a lunch. But we do know our Max Weber, and both of us have read it. So, so Max Weber, his mother, I think, if I remember correctly, was Huguenot. So basically, the talent from France, the entrepreneurial class from France, left. And the benefit of it accrued to Prussia, Switzerland, and England. So it seems Pakistan suffered from a similar malaise, fast forward a couple of or 3 centuries.
Exactly. I think thank you for bringing up that example. Of course, the entrepreneurial class, the Ahmadis and others, were not that big as the Huguenots in France and not that advanced, but at least they had set up an industry that was moving forward. And then because of the religious and other prosecution, they were forced to leave the country and the industries were taken over by the government. So that was one big blow that the government got. So when Bhutto was deposed by another military dictator, Ziaul Haq, it so happened that the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Now that's another milestone.
That's 1979.
1979. Ziaul Haq took over in 1977. Essentially, we can go into the reasons why he took it over, but essentially it was to save his neck because, Bhutto had some trouble, domestic trouble from his political opponents who believed that the recent election that had been held in 1976 were rigged. And they were rigged by the help of the military and others. So Ziaul Haq basically took over, and there were a lot of protests against. So the parallels with Imran Khan are striking. Circa, when the Nawaz Sharif government took over, he used to protest against rigging. Similarly, when Bhutto won the election, the opposition parties, they protested, countrywide protests. And Ziaul Haq supposedly came in to have fair elections in 3 months. But those 3 months led to 11 years. Essentially what happened that during his first years in office, the Russian, USSR invaded Afghanistan. And that, in a way, resulted in economic or taps of money being opened by the US to Ziaul Haq's regime. So that's another, interesting development that the US under Reagan, when he came into office in 81, he opened up the taps of credit and debt assistance to Pakistan, close to $12 billion. That has, by historical standards, huge.
Mm-hmm. And that must have led to an overvaluation of the rupee. And
again, that led to an overvaluation. So there was that superficial prosperity bought with credit and grants by the US. So then Pakistan supposedly flourished, but at the disadvantage of industrialization due to an overvaluation.
Deindustrialization. So here is Pakistan caught in the low productivity, low wage, low job spiral.
Right.
And it is basically overvalued rupee, and it is basically a subsidy economy. Just back to the point that you made is that all this time, through a quirk of history, and in fact, perhaps because of the Cold War, Pakistan gets a lot of easy money from the US.
Exactly.
And of course, money from Saudi Arabia after the oil boom, remittances.
Right.
So its rupee is artificially overvalued.
Exactly.
Which means it cannot develop its industry. And to add insult to injury, it has socialism imposed by that idiot, what's his name?
Bhutto. I would call him an evil genius.
The evil genius, the first Bhutto, who was prime minister. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the grandfather of Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, and the Ahmadi class, which Ahmadis whom he declares non-Muslims, who are the entrepreneurial class of Pakistan. They basically flee to England and other places and USA, and of course to Dubai and elsewhere, and they power growth elsewhere. So we've got to, let's say, the end of the 80s, and the,
so by the time exactly,
and the Soviet, and the Soviet Union is beaten now in Afghanistan.
Exactly.
And 3 years later, you have the fall of the Soviet Union itself.
Exactly.
So what is the story after that?
Okay, after that, Ziaul Haq mysteriously got killed in a plane crash. And
when is this? When does this happen?
This was in 1988.
1988. So just when...
after the Russians had left.
All right, just about when the Russians are leaving, around that time.
Around that.
Yeah.
They'd been defeated, they were leaving, and, he died in a plane crash. And that was the time that Bhutto's daughter,
Benazir
Bhutto, elections were called, her party won the elections, and she was made Prime Minister of Pakistan. Now, being the daughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, she continued the socialist policies, although she was more refined than her dad in terms of opening up the economies, but her rule was very short-lived. The military had become very powerful, starting from Ayub Khan, through Ziaul Haq, and they could not take orders from a woman, or prime minister democratically elected. So she only lasted 2 years. And at that time, what Ziaul Haq had done while he was president, he had amended the constitution. It was called the 18th Amendment, which basically gave the power to the president to dissolve the parliament at any time, and the prime minister. So that was a part that and since he was the president, Ziaul Haq, he exercised it himself.
No, he was dead by then, right? It was someone else.
But before he died, he had promulgated an 18th Amendment, whereby he gave himself before he died, he did have like a dummy parliament. He did have elections, non-party elections. Because of a lot of calls from the Americans and other Western democracies, he did hold elections, but non-party elections.
So the fig leaf of democracy, he preserved it, but as president, he had the power to dismiss anyone he didn't like.
Exactly.
And even after he died, the president continued to have that power.
Exactly.
And when Benazir...
It was called the 18th Amendment.
Got it. And when Benazir was prime minister... And she started giving orders to the military, they got the president to kick her out.
Exactly.
Okay.
Through the 18th Amendment. At that time, the guy who was president was Ghulam Isa Khan, who had been a mentor of Ziaul Haq and who had been an instrument in bringing Ziaul Haq to power. He was a civilian bureaucrat. So you can see another story that has been there, a theme, is the civilian bureaucracy and the military marriage.
So the Pakistan Administrative Service, which is the counterpart of the Indian Administrative Service, which is equally powerful or maybe a bit less, actually, I'm sure a bit less powerful than the Indian Administrative Service.
Right.
And in Pakistan's context, certainly less powerful than the military.
Right.
So between the two of them, they are ruling the country.
They are basically called the establishment. So Ghulam Isa Khan was basically the product of the civil service, and Ziaul Haq was a product of the military. So they had a pretty good alliance. And Ghulam Isa Khan became the president. First, he was Speaker of the National Assembly. Then when Ziaul Haq passed away, he became president. And then he dissolved Benazir's government. He brought in another party, which was Nawaz Sharif's government for about a couple of years. Then he got rid of the Nawaz Sharif government. And it so happened at that time, Benazir, a military guy, came into power. His name was Kakar, Abdul Wahid Kakar. That's another name to be remembered in Pakistani history, which is going against the military hegemony. This guy was a professional soldier. And by the way, my wife's uncle, he was the chief of army staff when there was a rift between Ghulam Ishaq Khan and Nawaz Sharif. Because Ghulam Ishaq Khan basically was a mentor to Nawaz Sharif also. He had promoted Nawaz Sharif. He had made him prime minister, but then they had a falling out. So they brought in Wahid Kakar, who was the chief of army staff, to intervene. So what he did, he sent both home. Instead, but he did even a weird thing that has never been done before. Well, in Pakistan, things have happened that have never been happened, unprecedented. Wahid Kakar said, okay, I'm going to bring in a neutral prime minister, and then we'll have elections in 3 months. And guess who is the neutral prime minister? He's the vice president of the World Bank. So can you believe it? A Pakistani, Moinuddin Qureshi, a Pakistani who has spent most of his life
in Washington,
sitting
D.C.
in Washington, dispensing aid to third world countries, is brought in to become a prime minister and hold elections.
Now, here's a question, Nasir. I mean, he was your wife Zali's uncle. Why didn't he import you into the administration?
Well, I was a new son-in-law. He was probably not aware
I see.
of me, and I would not probably have come in. One of the things I've maintained all my life, my staying in the USA has been a matter of choice. I could definitely have gone back.
Of course, you're a Khilji after all. You're royalty in Pakistan.
And basically being part of the ruling clique. But the thing is, it's a two-edged sword. One day you're in power, the next day you're out. I've been over the years offered some jobs in political, like as a deputy finance minister or a finance secretary, but I've always turned them down, basically for two reasons. One, it's against my principles of serving for a military or dictator. And secondly, we don't know how stable they are. That's a history. And, living in the US, as you know, Atul, even if you live honestly in Pakistan, even as a minister, you can't afford to educate your kids in the West.
That's true.
So I've been very fortunate that I have had good jobs in the USA. So I've never really had to go hat in hand to my in-laws. But I joke with my wife that every government in power always has had a representative of her family in there.
All right, so let's get back to the Kakar, your relative,
So
General
what do we have? So now we have this general, Wahid Kakar. He brings in a prime minister from the World Bank. They have elections again. And this time Benazir comes back into power. So she comes back into power with the help, and she appoints
with the help of whom?
With basically the help of the military. Because they got rid of Nawaz Sharif and Ghulam Ishaq Khan, and Wahid Kakar had elections done again, and the new Prime Minister Moinuddin Qureshi, who's a civil servant. By the way, the acting prime minister who came from the World Bank, he started his career in the administrative services.
Oh, he was Pakistan Administrative Service.
Yeah, so there's been this marriage also. It's called incest. A lot of Pakistani administrative services ended up going to the World Bank.
I mean, look. There is incest when it comes to India too. Members of the Indian Administrative Service go to Harvard Kennedy School and in the World Bank, and often they know very little of economics. In fact, I jokingly say they don't even know the E of economics, but still they are running the economy of the country.
This is exactly Pakistan's case. When you have people like Moinuddin Qureshi and others who were part of the administrative services, pose as economists.
They study literature quite often, or maybe something else. Sociology. They know their Max Weber.
Exactly. But they have this weird notion. Keynes once remarked, by the way, John Maynard Keynes, John Maynard Keynes remarked that, when you're talking to a medical doctor, the doctors and scientists have a jargon that escapes the normal person. So they don't know what language they're talking, because they're talking about all these names of organs and diseases and what's going on with the patient. Unfortunately for economics, that's what John Maynard Keynes. Although we talk in terms of our own jargon, the lay person thinks that they understand what we're talking about. For example, when we talk about profits, it's not what the lay person thinks is profit. Similarly, when we talk of unemployment, the layperson doesn't understand what we mean by unemployment. So there's a lot of jargon. So for that reason, the layperson thinks they understand everything about economics. and especially people who have been versed in literature, who thinks that they are very smart people, intelligent, and so on. So they understand what monopolies are and what economic profits are, and so on and so forth. And then they don't look at the real economist, and they take the advice very selectively.
Understood. So what you're saying is that Pakistan's economy was run by a bunch of amateurs from the Pakistan Administrative Service.
Exactly.
And fast forward, you now have Benazir back in power.
Exactly.
This time installed by the army. She's made her peace with the Pakistani military. Now what happens?
She comes in 97 on the second round.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Installed by the army. Now the army goes back supposedly to the barracks.
Mm-hmm.
The president is basically from Benazir's party. His name is Ligari. Mm-hmm. Farooq Ligari, a very prominent politician.
A landholder.
A landlord,
mm-hmm.
son of a Nawab, like they call it.
Mm-hmm. Nawab is a minor prince for our listeners who are not Indian, Pakistani or Bangladeshi.
Who went to Chiefs College, who was a civil servant, by the way, himself.
As well, also a member of the Pakistan Administrative Service.
Although he resigned and he joined politics. He was in the People's Party. He went to jail for the People's Party in Ziaul Haq's jail.
I see. So he was a loyalist of the Bhutto family.
Loyalist, and I want to pronounce it, and I want to re-emphasize that when he came as president, which Benazir made herself, I said that Benazir, for the first time, has everything, all her ducks in a row. She's got her own president. She can make her own policies, and she's fairly educated. She went to Harvard, and she knew, at least she was much better than her opponent, who was Nawaz Sharif, that we can talk about later, who was always opposing her from a different party. But anyway, 2 years later, Farooq Ligari, using the 18th Amendment, fires his own prime minister.
Ooh la la. Why?
Because of the military insistence that Benazir and her husband were meddling in the affairs of the military.
Now, let's get to
Benazir. So he better get rid of her, or they would get rid of her.
So we've talked about how the military starts intervening in the economy.
Yeah.
We've talked about Bhutto destroying Pakistan's economy through socialism. Let's talk about also the extraordinary corruption that also destroys the Pakistani economy. And of course, we have been discussing this for a while, and we have been talking, for instance, about Rockwood Estate, which Asif Ali Zardari bought, apparently 335 or 360 acres in Surrey. And of course, he was once known as Mr. 10%, which is 10% of every transaction went to him. And when he later came to power, a Pakistani friend, yes, he's still Mr. 10%, but now he takes 90% and 10% comes to us. So this is also a time when corruption, large scale, explodes, isn't it?
Okay, absolutely. Corruption, especially after Yahya Khan, when he left. Again, I'll have to put a background to this, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, how commercial corruption started in Pakistan. It started back, what Yahya Khan did early in his career when he took over the government, he fired over 300 senior civil servants in all services. Irrigation, engineers, all in government services. He fired them for corruption. So once he had fired them, until that time in the 1978, 79, if you were to take Pakistan from 47 to 1968, the word corruption was not a big deal in Pakistan. When we talked about corruption during those days, it was like an ordinary policeman stopping you, going through a red light, and pocketing 5 rupees. So that was a corruption confined to a lower class. The civil service, as you've been in the administrative services, so you know the history, the civil service, which was brought in by the Brits, was supposed to be very basically public servants. So public servants means public servant, that you're a volunteer. The purpose is not to make money, but essentially to serve the public.
Yeah, you had status, but you weren't taking big sums of
Exactly.
money as bribes.
Although you made decisions
Yeah.
that involved, I'll give you a very good example. My father, he was an engineer in the civil service. So when India split up into Pakistan and India, there was a lot of property of the Hindus who migrated to India, and it was lying there. So the decision was made by Pakistan that the migrants who were coming from India, the refugees, the Muslim refugees,
Muhajirs,
they are called, immigrants or Muhajirs, they would be allotted the Hindu property according to what they had left behind. My dad was basically like a middle civil servant, engineer by profession. Because Pakistan lacked civil servants, he was appointed as the administrator whose job was to split up this property among all these refugees or immigrants or Muhajirs. And he did that without taking anything up for himself.
Without a single paisa. Without a single
paisa.
rupee.
And there were billions of dollars worth of land and property that were given to the refugees. So that's where the civil service started, with that ethos.
Yeah. No, I have relatives who didn't take a single rupee as a bribe ever. And retired very honorably.
Exactly.
And of course, now, if you look at a lot of people who are my batchmates, a lot of them have stolen money hand over fist.
So when I was growing up, when I was 18, 19 years old, my dad was basically in the irrigation department dealing with landlords, allotting water to the rights to them, which meant a lot of money for the landlords. He lived a very simple life. He really believed in public service.
Understood. So when this changes.
When it changes around that turning point. When Yahya Khan starts firing civil servants, they now lack security. They don't know how long they're going to last. And, and they don't even get pensions when they were fired. So that's where the thing turned.
I see.
And the civil servants started thinking seriously about their future and whether they would ever go till retirement. So then this thing started slowly. So when Ziaul Haq came in, he did the same. He fired 1,500 civil servants.
Wow.
So with that insecurity that got built into the civil service, they started thinking about their futures. And so that's when the real corruption started. And then, at the same time, when there are people like you brought up Zardari, when Benazir Bhutto came in and became prime minister, there'd be a lot of people who...
Zardari didn't become prime minister, did he?
Benazir became prime minister.
Zardari was her husband.
He was her husband. So there would be rich businesses and others who would lobby him and say that if he could get the wife to sanction a contract in their favor, they'll give him some money. That's where the name got started.
Mr. 10%.
Mr. 5% or Mr. 10%.
Yeah.
So during Ziaul Haq's time, corruption became, in a way, semi-legal. Ziaul Haq at one time pronounced that corruption, the person who gives corruption needs something, and the person who takes corruption needs something. So in a way, he was condoning that.
Understood.
Even in the development literature, if you look at the literature, early thinkers about corruption used to think corruption lubricates the wheel of development.
It's basically yet another addition to the transaction costs in the economy.
It is, but it also lubricates it.
Understood.
Like, if you can't get something project done and you got this stupid civil servant who doesn't know what he's stopping, a little money in his pocket can move that project or industry forward if you are giving licenses and stuff. So at one time, the development economist condoned. They thought it was a cost of business.
I see. So it was basically grease for the squeaky wheel.
It was grease for the squeaky wheel. Now, that grease for the squeaky wheel, along the way, with immense sums of money that came in from U.S. assistance for weapons, armaments, fight against the Afghan war.
Charlie Wilson's war.
Then the military also started greasing their wheels, because when they had to buy tanks, foreign companies were giving them money for it. So the administrative services, when they were allotting, sanctioning land, they were greasing themselves. And with an overvalued rupee, they could go to England and buy these properties.
So let's stop for a second and just quickly point out to our listeners what is the result of this. You are gradually seeing an elite capture of the state. And this elite is not paying taxes. And even more importantly, it is starting to put its wealth in safe havens. Of course, London is one, England, as we pointed out,
and USA,
and later Dubai as well.
Dubai has been a great ground.
Yeah,
for that.
in fact, the joke is, and we've joked about it often at the dinner table, is the moment money from the International Monetary Fund comes in, property prices in Dubai rise instantly. So that means money's coming into Pakistan through the front door and leaving by the back door. And that brings us on to the more structural problems of the Pakistani economy. That why is it that Pakistan is rushing to the IMF, let's say 17
This is the 22nd
time already.
From 1958 onwards.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a very good point. Now that we got the elite established, now by elite I will mean the military, the civilian service,
Pakistan Administrative Service, the PAS,
and the business class and the landed community. Yeah. So this elite or establishment, essentially what Pakistan has emerged as is they have chronic budget deficits. They cannot collect enough tax revenues to finance their spending. A major part of it goes to the military and other perks that are given to the elite, subsidies that are provided to the elite, and those state-owned enterprises that are legacy of the Bhutto years.
They are legacy of the socialist experiment.
Although Pakistan has got rid of a lot of them, but there are some state-owned enterprises that refuse to be let go, like the PIA, Pakistan International Airlines, the steel mill. These are money-losing propositions.
So taxpayer money goes into these extremely inefficient enterprises.
Pakistan spends a lot of money subsidizing the elites because elites are the ones who drive cars. So motorways are being built for their cars to be on, but they don't pay enough taxes. So tax avoidance and evasion is the culture. Just to give you an idea, if I was sitting in Pakistan and I say to my friend, boast to my friend, I evaded taxes, he'll basically pat me on my back. Do I dare say that to an American friend here sitting in America?
I think you'd be in jail, Nasir.
Yeah. So there's a culture in the elite that not paying taxes is an achievement.
It's a badge of honor.
It's a badge of honor. This is a structural thing. They will not vote for anyone. So economists, by the way, I should talk about the role of the economist. Pakistan has had some fine economists. It doesn't suffer a dearth of economists. They've already told what the problem is, like I'm going to tell you. No one has been able to say how to solve the problem. And I won't be able to. I can tell you
you can
what
diagnose
the remedies
the problem,
are.
But you can't implement them.
We can't implement them because no government politically can stand the heat of the elite, which includes the military, the administrative services, the landlords. They get elected.
And the tiny business elite.
And the tiny business elite.
Which lives off the patronage of the state.
So everyone knows that Pakistan has a huge potential for income tax revenues. So does the IMF. The IMF knows that Pakistan can raise the money, number one. But everyone knows where the spending is going. It's going into money-making outfits, subsidizing the wrong people, essentially spending it on the military, overtly and covertly. People don't, when the government shows the budget to everyone, they say, well, out of our budget, hardly 20% of the government budget goes to the military. In fact, it's 50%.
Wow, as high as that?
Yeah, because they hide all the pensions and health and the welfare under the civilian spending.
They disguise it.
So they basically say money spent on the standing army is this much. Money spent on armaments is this much. So if you go to SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, they try to compile honest figures.
Yes, SIPRI is excellent.
Yeah, in fact, many years ago, one of the studies that I tried to do, which I did, was the title is Military Expenditures and Economic Growth in Pakistan. So I was looking for a causal link whether military expenditures had caused economic growth or retarded economic growth. The problem was that, and I went to SIPRI for independent figures, and they were just claiming that 6% of Pakistan GDP goes to military spending. So when I used those numbers, I didn't find either a positive or a negative relationship. It was a very inconclusive relationship between military spending and economic growth in Pakistan over 1960 all the way to over 2000. So, with that background, we have a very fundamental problem that economists have pointed out: lack of enough tax revenues. Pakistan has the lowest income tax rate, 10%. The IMF knows it. The IMF keeps telling Pakistan that they can raise it. But then the policymakers do not have the guts. And the spending side, everyone knows the spending is going to the military. Now, we're talking about spending and revenues.
Got it. So there's
these are flows.
Yeah,
now let's talk about assets.
Brilliant.
No one talks about the asset distribution. What the Pakistani government does at the same time, which is like an opportunity cost, a source of revenue, is that every time a general retires, he's given a piece of land whose value is in millions of rupees.
Yeah, millions of dollars, actually.
So that's what the guy does. He sells it and he moves to the West.
Uh-huh.
So you have this other source that no one really talks about, is the perks and the assets that are given to them for free. Land, cars, duty-free, like Mercedes, that they're free to dispose. Then there are colonies established. Land is bought at emergency rates, at low rates from poor landlords, and then given at subsidized rates to the military. So on the spending side, it's not only just the flows, but it's also the stocks that are given to the elite. And on the revenue side, not enough income tax revenues are being collected. So what is the result? The government has to survive. So they've introduced all kinds of nuisance taxes, which a lower middle class have to suffer.
So the lower middle class basically shoulders the burden of the state.
Exactly.
And that money collected from the lower middle class ends up subsidizing the elite and maybe some freebies for the poor.
Exactly. And so unfortunately what has happened that Pakistan chronically has had budget deficits for the reasons I mentioned, and they've chronically had balance of payment deficits because they continue importing stuff, but they can't sell anything. Atul, when I go back to Pakistan, I do not bring a single item that I purchase in Pakistan because either the quality is bad or they are overvalued. So Pakistan really has nothing to sell to the world. What do they have to sell? Labor. And the major export earners are remittances. So now can you imagine an economy of 240 million people does not have anything of high value added to export?
So what is the GDP of Pakistan and what is the per capita income? We have 240 million people living, in that country.
Exactly. So if you're talking about GDP, think of Pakistan land-wise as an area of Texas. It has a GDP in 2022 of $376 billion. Population is 242 million. Per capita income at market exchange rates is about $1,658. By way of comparison to the USA, the GDP nowadays is over $22 trillion. So you can imagine, with a population of 340 million people. Per capita income in the USA is close to 90 to 100,000. So 100 times the size of the Pakistani per capita.
50 times. 2,000.
2,000 versus 100.
Yeah, exactly. Over 50 times. Yeah.
Exactly. Over 50 times. But at purchasing power, it'll be a less drastic thing because, in terms of purchasing power, instead of 376 billion, we will be talking about 500 billion.
Excellent.
And similarly, we'd be talking about like close to 3,000 per capita. So that's basically
it's
the structure.
It's a very poor country. So you have a lot of people living in poverty.
Exactly.
And And of course, many of those people now have been protesting the latest
Exactly. And in
upheaval in
terms of the
Pakistan.
distribution, in the wealth, given it's a poor country, and now you've got the elite middle class, the top 1% of income earners control 9% of the income. 1% of the landlords control 22% of the arable land.
Oof.
And the bottom 20% hold 50% income. And the 20% of the top class hold 50% of the income.
Wow.
And the poorest 20% only get 11% of the income. So it's a very highly unequal distribution of income, wealth, and access to education and all the other amenities. At one time, I used to favorably cite that close to, I think, only 40% have safe access to safe water. 40% have access to healthcare. So it's a very poor economy, and the reasons we have mentioned. But in terms of wealth, if one were to keep in mind, this is the size of Texas, much more, and the biggest sector is agriculture. Pakistan is a fairly fertile land. Let's look at some advantages that Pakistan has. The British left a great legacy. It's got a full network of roads. It's got an extensive network of canals. It's got 5 rivers that go from north to south. And the water is distributed throughout Pakistan through a system of well thought out canals that went throughout that entire system. So land is fertile. Agriculture is a fairly dominant sector. It is self-sufficient in food, Pakistan. They've never had any famine or anything like that. So in terms of agriculture, they're okay. But in terms of economic progress, development progress, Pakistan ranks very low on the Human Development Index.
Yeah, and we've discussed this many a time. Pakistan, despite all its problems, has basically crawled along because of remittances coming from abroad, because of informal welfare networks. Your family supports you, your second cousin supports you, something happens, you move in with your extended family. And you have a black or shadow economy, which basically is not even captured by official statistics. So things just basically move along. Yeah.
And another thing we should mention that Ziaul Haq brought into Pakistan is this whole thing about the terrorism, the Islamic terrorism that has inculcated the country.
So this is of course partly Saudi funded, because Saudis funded the madrasas.
Exactly.
And Pakistan and even India, it has gone from the land of Khuda Hafiz, a Farsi term, which we used in the subcontinent for 800 years, from 1192 onwards, to Allah Hafiz.
Exactly. So this whole scourge of terrorism essentially has been brought into the Middle East money, the madrasa system, this whole concept of misconstrued concept of Islam, a very weird form of Islam, the
Wahhabi, doctrinaire Wahhabi Islam.
Doctrinaire concept of Islam. That is a scourge that Pakistan did not have when Ayub Khan left. So it started during Ziaul Haq years, when the Russians came into Afghanistan.
So if I may interject, it's very incongruous that on the one hand it is such an Islamic country, but on the other hand, if you look at the elite, and we were Googling around before this podcast, and we found reports of orgies being conducted in Bhutto's Rockwood estate or UK, British properties. So on the one hand, you have this extreme Wahhabi Islam, which everyone sort of adheres to and uses Allah Hafiz, a very incongruous term, instead of Khuda Hafiz. But on the other hand, the elite is licentious,
secular
in private, and frankly, very excessive in its use of alcohol, drugs, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
They're like juvenile delinquents, exactly. Because that's what they do. Even in Pakistan, it's a very hypocritical society. Like, the elite goes around acting very Islamic, and their
public.
houses are in public,
Yeah.
and their houses are full of liquor and stuff, that they espouse that they don't do anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's a very hypocritical society. Lying is okayed. Lack of morality. So it is, it's so hypocritical that we have a society, a culture where corruption and lying and deceit is part of your ethos, but then you act just the converse of that. And those are some of the reasons. There's no excuse mechanism that's going to bring about a change in Pakistan. It has to come from within. And looking outward and looking at the future, I do not see I'm not very optimistic about the future of Pakistan. The only way forward, if they were to happen, and which is not happening, and I think the IMF has what the IMF stance is presently, maybe the right step forward. They are refusing to release a tranche of only $1 billion to Pakistan. Keep in mind, we're talking about a 350 billion economy, only $1 billion. Basically, because they have finally had it. Can you believe going to the IMF 22 times?
It's like a drug addiction problem.
It's like a drug addiction. So the only hope Pakistan has, which will bring a revolution, is if they stop getting funding from the IMF and the international and the USA. But then the USA has its own interests, which are very pragmatic. They do not really care what happens internally as long as Pakistan is on their side. So they've been doling out all this money. Same is the case with Saudi Arabia.
And Egypt. It's geopolitical rent in a way.
It's like Egypt. Pakistan is exactly like Egypt, in many ways. There's one major difference. Egypt has a better social welfare system because Nasser did a number on that one. Which Pakistan
We're talking about not you, but Jamal Abdel Nasser.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that distinguishes the Middle East from Pakistan is that the social welfare system in Egypt, because of Nasser and the socialist policies that they had, their social welfare is much ahead of Pakistan. Other than that, they're the same. They're a rentier state. Not much progress is being made. Egypt explicitly has the military ruling it. Pakistan implicitly has the military ruling it. Both are getting benefits out of it. They are not interested in progress. They want the status quo. The elite is not willing to give up, increased taxes on themselves. They want all the perks and privileges. So it is, I was just in Pakistan about 6 months ago, and a very senior bureaucrat from the elite administrative cadre.
Yeah, the Pakistan Administrative
Who's
Service.
actually a brother-in-law to my wife, again, sadly to say, a senior bureaucrat who had just retired. When I started talking about the role of the bureaucracy, he became abusive. He could not even sit there and have a decent civil discourse about the role of the civil service in Pakistan. He was basically using abusive words that I said, I am surprised that you're doing it. So they're very protective
of their interests.
Of their interests. Yeah. And now, let's talk about Imran Khan. Now, what he has done. Imran Khan belongs to, again, the elite class. He's from the middle class. He's done a number of things that have not been done before. First, he, in his own right, he has been a captain of a cricket team, which is a very big deal compared to all the other politicians that are around Pakistan.
So, they're all members of the Lucky Sperm Club. In fact, Bilawal Bhutto Zardari can't even speak Urdu.
Yeah,
he speaks Urdu with an English accent.
Exactly.
And Nawaz Sharif's daughter, Maryam Nawaz Sharif, she's also haughty and thick-headed.
Exactly. If you were to take all the politicians on the ruling alliance, PDM they call it, and put them side to side to Imran Khan, there's a world apart. Imran Khan is a guy who went to Oxford.
He wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer at Oxford. He's not that clever, but compared to Bilawal Bhutto, he's a genius.
There you go. He was there. He led a cricket team to the World Cup. At least he was a leader of something. Mm-hmm. He married a very rich woman of the British aristocracy, and he was patriotic enough to leave her to stay in Pakistan. He doesn't have any estate in England, unlike Zardaris and Nawaz Sharif and all the ruling coalition. So what he has done...
I mean, he was a playboy, but at least he was open and honest about that.
Yeah, and he's got his own money. So he's not corrupt that way.
Yeah.
No one has been able to prove any corruption against him. They keep filing charges. One of the other interesting thing about Pakistan is, it's probably the same, Atul, in USA, is there's so many laws that are on the books that you're probably breaking one every day. So you better be careful that if you're critical of the government, that you're really squeaky clean, because they'll find something on you. It may be a speeding ticket, or it may be, that your grass is growing too long, or something happens, you're breaking zoning laws. Similarly, in Pakistan, they have 100 more, and then they have corruption.
It's a colonial state. All colonial states tend to have draconian laws, and you suffer from rule by law rather than rule of law.
Yeah.
And so law can be used as an instrument of oppression, and certainly of, let's say, pinpricks, if nothing else.
So I'm not a supporter of Imran Khan. I've just pointed out the differences. But the last thing I'd say about Imran Khan, he's captured the imagination of basically the kids of this middle class, educated kids. They call them Yutiyas. And they basically, through social networks and so on, they basically have become very disappointed in these old politicians and the elite class. So that is a new thing that Imran Khan has brought to the fore. So if there's any hope in the future of Pakistan, is this open information. Like you've got this educated lower middle and middle class that may stand up and make a difference going forward. But right now, the outlook, unless something grows from within, I don't know how long Imran Khan can stand the heat, continue this war. He's already above 70. So that's my outlook for the Pakistan, politically and economically.
I see. So economically, things are in a mess. Economically, things are in a free fall. And the only hope are the youth, who argue for greater transparency and basically the taming of the elite.
Yes.
Now, what happens if that does not transpire? What are we looking at?
Essentially, that's a very interesting question. How that's going to transpire, let's say, over the next... I'm very pessimistic about the prospects of Imran Khan. Unless the military is the real power. Unless the military right now, and the military are not that keen on Nawaz Sharif either. But right now they find them to be lesser of the two evils. They think that the Nawaz Sharif coalition, the PDM that they call it.
Yeah, which is just for our listeners, they should know that Pakistan has two rival political families, the Sharifs and the Bhutto Zardaris.
Exactly.
And right now, the army has booted out, or the military has booted out, which, is mainly the army, has booted out Imran Khan and brought in a coalition of both the Bhutto Zardaris and the Sharifs.
Yes.
And Bilawal Bhutto Zardari is the foreign minister of Pakistan, and Shehbaz Sharif, the younger brother of Nawaz Sharif, is the prime minister of Pakistan. And so they are in a in a coalition of convenience to basically enjoy the fruits of power, and they are keeping their side of the bargain, their Faustian pact with the military, that they don't at all touch the military's powers.
By way of exactly. That's a very good background perspective. By way of background, the PTI did win the elections in 2018.
The PTI, just if you could tell our listeners
Pakistan
the full form.
Tehreek-e-Insaf, which is a party started by Imran Khan.
The Justice Party, basically.
Justice Party. And basically they become pretty popular and dominant. So they came in on a 5-year term. The National Assembly is the parliament. About a year ago, the National Assembly, Imran Khan lost confidence in the National Assembly because he had a very narrow coalition. And the military backed the alliance of the Zardari and Nawaz Sharif parties. So they were brought in to complete the tenure of the National Assembly. The tenure is going to be completed in October. So according to the Constitution, elections have to be held by October. Polls suggest that if elections are, and the reason I'm saying if, I'll explain later, but if elections are held in October, polls suggest that Imran Khan's party will win with a majority. Now, the military and the ruling alliance of the Zardari, the PPP, and the Nawaz Sharif clan,
the Lucky Sperm Club coalition.
Exactly. They do not want this to happen. So they're trying to prolong the election date as much as possible or get rid of Imran Khan so that they can have an easy go at the election. So that's the status quo right now. The military is with them. On May 9th, recently, Imran Khan was arrested again on a pending charge, essentially on the premises of the High Court, which is again very illegal because the military did it. So there was a lot of disturbances that happened. As a result of that, there was a lot of violence and arson by Imran Khan supporters. And now what is happening...
He also suffered an assassination attempt.
The general feeling is, again, there was a conspiracy by the ruling party coalition to get rid of him. They would like nothing much better than to get rid of Imran Khan. So another possibility is, if they make life difficult enough for Imran Khan, he may agree to go in exile for a couple of years so that the elections can be held and the ruling coalition can continue with the military as the benefactor. So that's one outlook.
And if that happens, what happens?
Then we're going to limp along. A lot depends on how Saudi Arabia... The problem is that the main benefactors of Pakistan in terms of priority are basically China, Saudi Arabia, and the USA. Mm-hmm. Now, these three benefactors, they like to have a stable and certain alliance with Pakistan.
And let's explain very quickly why the Chinese support Pakistan as a counter to India. The Saudis support Pakistan because they have an informal deal that they will have access to Pakistan's nuclear weapons in case they need them against Iran.
Yes.
And the US just does not want a nuclear-armed state full of jihadis to go berserk.
Exactly. And the Pakistan military is much in line with the US military. They've been trained in the USA, so they have a good relationship with the military.
The senior people.
The senior people have a good relationship. Yeah. And the nuclear weapon is a big point, that they don't want that to be falling in the hands of the jihadi. So with these three, as long as these benefactors continue, and probably the IMF deal will come through, which will keep Pakistan continuing the way it has been going forward.
But Nasir, just one quick last thought before we sign off, because it's been a long podcast. We'll come back to our listeners for more, is that things last until they don't. And right now, Pakistan is a much more urban society. Urbanization has raised expectations. Yes. There's now social media. People are watching YouTube, people are seeing TikTok, people are on Twitter and whatnot, and they are a lot more discontented. And there is a potential that everything could blow up as in 1979 in Iran. That is a possibility, isn't it?
But keep in mind, that's a very good point. But if we go back to the Iranian Revolution and the way it blew up, was essentially very similar, that the elite class, it was the majority, which was mostly religious and had been exploited by the elite, which was very narrow, and especially the USA. Mm-hmm. The role of the USA had been very pronounced in suppressing the Iranians.
Yes.
After 1954.
53.
Mossadegh.
Yeah, Mossadegh.
So essentially, this was a culmination.
Just, we are giving a lot of references. So very quickly, Mossadegh was a democratically elected prime minister of Iran. He nationalized oil industry, and he did it after not being paid his due by Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, modern-day BP. They were paying $16 cents to a dollar. He wanted a 50-50 deal. And so in come MI6 and CIA, and they boot him out, and they bring in the Shah. And the Shah basically runs a racket, basically billion-dollar coronation parties and whatnot, and the people are suffering.
And supported by the U.S. military and the Cold War.
Exactly.
He was an ally. So if the question is, are we going to have something like that happen in Pakistan? Actually, there's a big difference here between Pakistan now. All the factors you mentioned, the social media, more information, the educated youth, they're getting. One of the safety valves is there are a lot of youth that gets disenchanted. They leave the country. So as long as immigration is open, they get discouraged and they leave.
Mm-hmm.
That escape valve has kept the revolution from Pakistan, number one. So that may not ever happen because they leave the country.
Mm-hmm. The most brilliant of minds and the most energetic of Pakistanis leave.
They leave instead of hanging around and taking the jails and all that stuff.
Yeah. So you mean to say if you'd not been in the country, you might have blown it all up?
Exactly. If they were to stay there, and so immigration is a big safety valve, number one.
Yeah.
Okay. Number two, as I was remarking, unlike other revolutions, the civil wars happen because both sides are supported by external forces. So right now, there is a likelihood of civil war between the disenchanted youth and the civilians who are pro-Imran Khan and the others, but they have no weapons. The only organized unit in Pakistan that has weapons is the Pakistan military. Who will supply? And let me ask you this, Atul. Do you think India may start supplying weapons to the youth?
No, not at all.
No, there's no taker out there. The Afghan Taliban are not going to provide that. They're doing their own damage anyway. So that scenario is not going to happen. It could only happen, but you may be surprised. It may come to pass that if they keep going after it, and if Imran Khan continues that, they drive him into exile. He may start collecting weapons and arming his followers, but that is not part of Pakistan's history.
Understood. Yeah. So more likely Pakistan will limp along, more likely
poverty with the help of its friends, unfortunately.
More likely poverty will persist.
Yes.
And more likely Pakistan will be an unsettled place in the years, maybe decades to come.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you very much for listening to us from FO Podcasts. It is bye for now.